old hands were already grumbling. Late Friday afternoon, Gary Swenson wandered into Fennebresk's office. Swenson was a 20-year First Boston veteran with a Midwestern sobriety that Fennebresk, a Long Islander, found irresistible. "You know, we're missing the goddamn boat on this deal," Swenson said. "What do you mean?" Fennebresk asked. "Everybody on Wall Street has a horse in this thing except us. We're the only ones not involved. We're getting passed by, I tell you. I know what we need to do. Let's put a group together and do it ourselves, buy the whole thing. It's just what this place needs. It could really turn this place around." At first, Fennebresk dismissed the idea. It was just too big, too crazy. But as Swenson talked, Fennebresk found his enthusiasm catching. He called in several bankers, including David Batten, a veteran First Boston executive ending his first week in a new post in the merger department. Batten shared Swenson's concerns. Arriving 4 days earlier from the firm's London office, he recalled finding a palpable lack of self-confidence in the air. Batten told his colleagues, "What this place really needs is a shot in the arm. God damn it, we're still at the top of the heap. We can accomplish as much as anyone." The group brainstormed in Fennebresk's office. First Boston could call in its Swiss affiliate Credit Suisse, they reasoned, and the two firms' London joint venture. Together, the three firms could canvass the globe looking for money and assemble a bidding group. They owed it to themselves to try. Fennebresk got excited. He phoned Maher, who walked down from his office. Fennebresk laid out their plan. Did Maher think it could work? Maher pondered the idea for a moment. "I wouldn't object to that," he said. Fennebresk found the response, so typical of Maher, maddening. "I wouldn't object to that? What kind of reaction is that? This is a great idea." It was exactly the facet of Maher's personality his friend found so exasperating. How many times had Fennebresk pleaded with Maher to stand on a desktop and give a stirring speech? The enthusiasm just wasn't in him. Fennebresk roped together a group and began telephoning LBO buyers who might be interested in forming a consortium to bid for RJR Nabisco. Maher, a man badly in need of good news, finally got some the following week. To his surprise, his pursuit of Philip Morris paid off. The company, although still locked in a fight for Kraft, hired First Boston to analyze a possible bid for RJR Nabisco. Maher knew chances were small that Philip Morris would acquire RJR, but maybe, Maher thought, it might drop its Kraft bid if it cut a friendly deal with Ross Johnson. If so, First Boston could use Philip Morris as the centerpiece of a consortium to buy the company. For Maher's closest advisors, the Philip Morris assignment was especially sweet. It held out the prospect of spoiling Wasserstein's coup on the Kraft bid while gaining a share of the RJR Nabisco battle, all in one fell swoop. "This is great," enthused Fennebresk. "It fucks Bruce on Kraft. It fucks Bruce on RJR. It preserves our relationship with Philip Morris, and it gets us into the RJR deal. Beautiful." Fennebresk's group, meanwhile, was having little luck assembling the consortium Maher envisioned building around Philip Morris. Fennebresk had met several times with aides of billionaire investor John Kluge, but the talks went nowhere. Disclosure of Johnson's management contract had lent the deal a patina of greed, from which Kluge recoiled. Several days later, Maher learned that Philip Morris was about to strike a friendly deal with Kraft, and thus wasn't likely to chase RJR Nabisco any further. Coming on the heels of the failed Kluge talks, the news struck Maher like a blow to the stomach. His worst fear now seemed unavoidable. First Boston was to be the only major Wall Street firm left out of the deal of the century. For several days, First Boston's RJR team fell into a funk. Greg Malcolm, the firm's junk bond chief, jokingly captured the mood. "We're just a dog chasing a bus," he told colleagues. The inference was clear. First Boston, in attempting to join the battle for RJR, was out of its league. As the bankers' minds idled, doubts about First Boston's direction returned. Fennebresque, plagued with dire visions, flew off to Minnesota to scout a minor acquisition candidate. Can we ever be the same again? He found himself wondering. Bruce made us all feel so special. You couldn't help but bask in his reflected glory. Can we ever regain that feeling that we were special? Unlike Fennebresque, few witnessed Maher's demons. To outsiders, he remained impassive, steady as ever. Inside, Maher was scared. He had tried every way he knew to get a piece of the RJR Nabisco deal and had gotten nowhere. He knew what people were whispering behind his back. First Boston has lost it. They'll never be the same again without Wasserstein. Our franchise was on the line, Maher recalled. It was crucial we get involved in this deal. Maher wasn't totally without options. One idea particularly intrigued him. Late one Friday afternoon, Brian Finn had burst into his office with another of his schemes. In his excitement, Finn had ordered Maher's secretary to hold all calls. "If you fucking pick up the phone, I'll kick your ass," a smiling Finn told his boss. "Now shut up and pay attention to me." Maher harbored a special affection for Finn, one of First Boston's brightest young stars. Finn was Wall Street's version of a computer hacker, a brash numbers cruncher who spent hours alone ruminating about takeover tactics. A fervent New York Mets fan, he developed his love for numbers as a kid computing batting averages. As First Boston's specialist on anti-takeover restructurings, Finn patrolled the outer edges of accepted merger strategies, twisting and reshaping corporate balance sheets to mount creative defenses to hostile takeovers. His boyish face, unruly brown hair, and rumpled suits, not to mention his lightning-fast mind, reminded some of a young Bruce Wasserstein. In fact, Finn had been a Wasserstein favorite and became the subject of an intense tug-of-war between his departing mentor and Maher. Maher won out after a long evening's talk in which he and Finn drained a bottle of gin. "In the end, I just couldn't kick Jimmy when he was down," Finn said. Finn brought Maher's attention to a 2-page memo lying unread on his desk. Finn had sent it that morning after being hit with an idea during the hour-long drive to his new Long Island home. The strategy laid out in the memo was, Maher could see, complex, incomplete, and an incredible long shot. It turned on an esoteric tax law loophole set to expire December 31st, just 2 months away. In its first step, Finn's plan called for First Boston to acquire RJR's food businesses for a bundle of securities known as installment notes. In theory, at least, First Boston could take those notes to a major bank and receive money for them, a process known as monetization. The beauty of the idea was that using the loophole, taxes on the notes could be deferred for 10 or 20 years, creating a tax savings of as much as $4 billion. In the plan's second step, First Boston would auction off Nabisco, passing on 80% of the profits to RJR shareholders and keeping the remainder. RJR's board could save billions of dollars and pass on its windfall to shareholders on a tax-free basis. First Boston would then acquire RJR's remaining tobacco businesses in a conventional $15 billion leveraged buyout. The installment note loophole, discovered by Wall Street Tax Counsel in reaction to tax law restrictions in 1986 and 1987, had first been used in the sale of several businesses in the wake of Compo Corporation's 1988 takeover of Federated Department Stores. So successful was it in saving taxes that Congress eliminated it in September, but legislators made the move effective at year-end, giving First Boston and other corporate buyers a brief window of opportunity. Finn proposed to drive the largest takeover in history right through that window. Maher was skeptical. To himself, he wondered if the idea wasn't just a little too flaky, a little too outlandish for such a high-profile deal. Installment notes had never been tried on such a scale. Hundreds of questions, Maher knew, would have to be resolved before the sketchy plan could be considered a viable alternative. "There's a lot left to resolve," Finn acknowledged. "So," Maher had said, "go resolve." First Boston's search for a bidding partner had stalled after talks fell through with the Kluge Group. Then, on November 9th, after a week of inactivity, Leon Calvaria walked into Dave Batten's glass-walled office. Calvaria was a cigar-chewing Rhodesian who had aided the unsuccessful search for a partner. "God damn it," Calvaria groused. "Let's not just give up." He and Batten hauled out the lists of potential partners and looked at them once more. Had they forgotten to call anyone? The two bankers threw out name after name until they came to one Batten didn't recognize: Resource Holdings. "What about them?" Calvaria asked. "Who is it?" "It's Jay Pritzker." Batten wasn't heartened. Pritzker, the respected Chicago investor who owned Hyatt Hotels, had a reputation as being unwilling to pay top dollar for acquisitions. First Boston hadn't even bothered to contact his people. But time was running out. Bids were due in 9 days. "Why not?" Batten said. "Make the call." Later that day, Calvaria reached Jerry Seslow, Resource Holdings' chief executive. At 42, Seslow, a roly-poly former accountant with Groucho Marx eyebrows, kept a low profile on Wall Street. After 11 years at the Big Eight accounting firm Pete Marwick Mitchell and Company, where he worked with Pritzker and other big-name investors, he had begun his own small investment firm. Resource Holdings spent much of its time considering investment options for Pritzker and Denver billionaire Philip Anschutz, the rest for a stable of other investors, Indianapolis shopping mall king Melvin Simon and Cincinnati investor Carl Lindner, among others. On Wall Street, Seslow was considered a minor leaguer whose client list occasionally enabled him to hit a home run. Seslow listened patiently as Calvaria made his pitch. He liked the young Rhodesian, and he knew First Boston badly wanted a way into this deal. But to Seslow, Calvaria's idea smacked of desperation. "You have to be crazy," he told Calvaria. "For us to come into this at this late date, it's too little, too late. Leon, go home." Calvaria persisted, but Seslow would hear no more. "Forget it, Leon. Go home." Only later was Calvaria reminded of Brian Finn's unusual strategy. Finn's tax thing, as it would come to be called. He tried Seslow again the next day. "Jerry, we have an edge. We have a tax structure that could give shareholders $8 to $10 in additional cash, which can't be done by KKR or Shearson. Can we come up and make a presentation?" Seslow relented. "Okay, come on over." The next morning, Fennebresque and Calvaria spent an hour going over their idea with Seslow. The First Boston bankers hinted they had other major clients, they mentioned Pepsi, that might go along as well. Seslow, impressed, said he would study the idea further. "I wish you guys had called us 2 weeks ago," he said. Jay Pritzker listened closely as Seslow's voice crackled over the line from New York. At 66, Pritzker headed a family acknowledged to be among America's sharpest investors. He was a small, wiry man, still energetic after triple and quadruple bypass heart surgery. Grandson of a Russian-born pharmacist who emigrated to Chicago from Kiev in 1881, Pritzker had built over 4 decades a business empire as notable for its diversity as its profitability. It centered on 2 businesses, the Hyatt hotel chain and Marmon Group, a secretive conglomerate with tentacles into more than 60 businesses, from ready-mix concrete to Ticketmaster. Low-key and headline-shy, the Pritzkers made a rare splash in the mid-1980s with a bold attempt to resuscitate bankrupt Braniff Airlines, an effort that ultimately proved disappointing. That Friday, Jay Pritzker listened skeptically as Jerry Seslow detailed First Boston's unusual tax strategy. Jerry, it's too late," Pritzker said. Formal bids were due in just 7 days. But Seslow persisted. As the two discussed their probable competitors, Shearson and Kravis, Seslow detected a shift in Pritzker's interest. Pritzker had long been an admirer of Henry Kravis and was impressed by his intense interest in RJR. If Henry is there, Jay Pritzker said, maybe there's something to it. Billionaires have a way of making friends. One of Jay Pritzker's closest friends and advisors was Melvin N. Klein, an amiable Corpus Christi, Texas investor who, while working on Wall Street in the early 1970s, had become friends with Henry Kravis. In early 1988, Klein had formed an investment fund with Harry Gray, the former chairman of United Technologies. The fund's third partner was a partnership headed by Jay Pritzker. By that spring, Gray Klein, armed with $500 million in newly raised capital, had attempted to invest in a number of high-profile takeovers, including the battle for Federated Department Stores. In February, a Gray Klein limited partner named Daniel Lufkin proposed that Pritzker and Gray Klein investigate an LBO of RJR Nabisco. The plan was dubbed Project Smokescreen. Klein and the Pritzkers spent months analyzing the proposal. None knew Ross Johnson, so Klein had suggested they feel out Kravis about a joint approach. Klein pitched the idea to Kravis at a breakfast May 4th. "There's no way he's going to do this," Kravis had said, relating details of his earlier meeting with Johnson. "Just no way." That was the end of Project Smokescreen. In October, after Johnson's initial proposal was announced, Klein had called Kravis again and expressed interest in acquiring a minority stake in any Kravis buyout of the company. Kravis had said he would think about it. Friday afternoon, Pritzker phoned Klein in Texas. "Mel, what is our obligation to Henry Kravis on RJR?" Klein said he knew of none, but would check. That afternoon, as Pritzker weighed whether to join forces with First Boston, Klein reached Kravis. "I just want to be up front with you," he said. "It looks like Jay Pritzker may team up with First Boston on a third-party bid for RJR Nabisco." "Thanks, Mel," Kravis said. "I appreciate that." Hope was dwindling fast for First Boston when Maher convened a meeting in his office that Friday afternoon. His only chance of avoiding the ignominy of being left out of the RJR Nabisco deal was Finn's flaky restructuring proposal. He called in Finn and a handful of others to figure out what to do. Outside, the sun was setting. As a metaphor, it seemed all too apt. Finn had drawn up a more detailed set of plans for the meeting. Using the installment note loophole to acquire RJR, he projected up to $4 billion in savings on taxes deferred beyond the year 2000. If everything clicked exactly right, Finn figured, First Boston might earn almost $300 million in fees, 4 times the largest merger advisory fee ever. But Finn knew Maher was interested in more than fees. Ancillary benefits, he noted in his memo, included a dramatic impact on M&A market share and immeasurable public relations franchise benefits. In short, Finn suggested, if they pulled this one off, they would never have to hear about Bruce Wasserstein again. There were, Finn admitted, some unique problems to be ironed out. For one thing, deferring $3.5 billion in taxes, a conservative scenario, was unprecedented. According to Finn's calculations, this single transaction would boost the annual federal budget deficit by 2%. If First Boston proposed it, RJR Nabisco's board would almost certainly have to take into account the political fallout. "It's clear," Finn said, "that Washington would go apeshit." But the brash young banker argued that Congress was unlikely to intervene. Legislators had specifically extended the use of installment notes until year-end, and Congress would be in recess during much of the approaching auction. What were the chances of a special session being called to trash an LBO? "They can't do anything," Finn stated. Still open was the question of whether First Boston needed partners to make Finn's idea work. Some argued for flying solo. Maher wasn't so sure. A respected partner would add legitimacy, something Maher was acutely aware his team might need. Maher's wish was about to come true. As darkness fell outside his window, Leon Calvaria stepped out to take a call. It was Jerry Seslow. Jay Pritzker's former accountant sounded excited. "Leon, we've talked it over with Jay. We're there. Let's move." Finn sat in the dingy conference room overlooking Rockefeller Center and fumed. Why are these guys giving us so much grief? They ought to be happy we're here. It was Tuesday morning, just 3 days before the Friday bid deadline, and Finn and 3 First Boston colleagues had come to Lazard's offices to present their proposal in detail. Finn was always surprised how ratty Lazard's suite seemed. The floors probably hadn't been carpeted since 1932, he said to himself. First Boston had pitched its proposal as a restructuring rather than an acquisition. Maher was betting the board might instinctively wish to keep RJR Nabisco independent, and a restructuring, albeit a drastic one, might be an easier pill to swallow than those offered by Kravis or Cohen. First Boston and the Pritzkers were offering to work with the board to sell the food businesses, pass along proceeds to shareholders, and leave the tobacco business intact. As the meeting progressed, Finn sized up the 2 bankers across the table. Luis Rinaldini of Lazard, Finn knew, was sharp, a good talker, like himself, a rising star. John Mullen of Dillon Reed impressed Finn as a relic of pre-1970 Wall Street, a stodgy, white-shoe banker playing way out of his league in the fast-moving 80s. "We don't see this board participating in this kind of complicated transaction," Rinaldini was saying, "not with all this risk from Washington." The Lazard banker was shaking his head. "It's too risky. It's not their style. Of course, we don't want to discourage you in any way." The hell you don't, Finn thought. He realized what was happening. These guys are offended. They think we're screwing up their process. They think we're making a mockery of the whole thing. Finn suspected he knew what the real problem was. We're doing their jobs for them. They should have thought of this themselves. They think we're trying to steal their jobs. Far from welcoming First Boston's interest, the special committee seemed to be snubbing it. Finn left the meeting fearing this was going to be far tougher than he had hoped. Maher read Peter Atkins's letter in disgust. The board wasn't going to allow First Boston a chance for due diligence. If First Boston wanted to bid, it would have to fly blind. Its only guide, an annual report, and a stack of 10Ks. It didn't seem fair. "I don't know what we're going to do," a disappointed Maher told Atkins on Wednesday, 2 days before the bidding deadline. "I expect we'll give you something to think about on Friday, which may or may not make your life easier." Atkins remained non-committal. "Do what you want to do." News of First Boston's odd proposal surfaced in the press Thursday morning. Few details were available, but almost no one seemed to take it seriously. Bruce Wasserstein told anyone who would listen what a joke the First Boston approach was. On Friday, an unnamed board advisor savaged the overture in the Wall Street Journal as Mickey Mouse. At Shearson, Tom Hill had nothing but contempt for the First Boston offer. Maher is so desperate he'll do anything, Hill thought. The installment note scheme, he believed, was a gimmick that would never work in a deal this size. Hill considered Seslow a lightweight, a real amateur. "They've got everybody in this deal except Abbott and Costello," Hill cracked, "and they're dead." Hill and the Solomon Sausages saw the wide girth of Ira Harris behind Jay Pritzker's sudden interest in RJR Nabisco. Harris, now advising the board, was so close to Pritzker that Hill called them blood brothers. Pritzker's entry into the fray was no accident, Hill decided. The special committee needed a stalking horse to replace Forceman Little, so Harris came up with Pritzker. At 9 West, John Martin took to ranting how Fat Ira was bent on mucking up their deal. In fact, Harris had spoken to Pritzker that Monday and had risen at the special committee meeting to urge listening to what First Boston and the Pritzkers had to say. But even his backing didn't persuade Atkins to give the new group any information. 2 days left. As the deadline neared, Johnson's malaise lifted a bit. He began to grow worried what effect the onslaught of stinging publicity might be having on the board. Wednesday, he called Hugel. "Charlie," he said, "if you're going to run this, I want your word that if we give our best bid, you're not going to play games and try to negotiate us all over the place." "You've got my word. Are you going to be opening the bids? I don't want any funny business." "I'll be right there," Hugel said. "I'll personally open the bids." "If you're worried about the publicity," Hugel continued, "why don't you call the directors and explain yourself?" Johnson began calling directors the next day. His approach was always the same. "My conscience is clear," he told each director. "I can sleep at night because I don't think I've done anything wrong. Whatever happens, the management group has gotten the stock up, and that's what's important." To each he downplayed the management agreement, emphasizing his intention to spread the money around. In the days leading up to the deadline, Johnson spent long evenings at Jim and Linda Robinson's apartment, hashing through pricing strategies. Most nights, Horrigan, who had a company apartment downstairs, would join them, and Linda would scurry around serving drinks. Johnson was a Scotchman. Jim Robinson preferred a glass of wine. Horrigan insisted on hard liquor, what Linda referred to as grown-up drinks. Linda herself sipped berry-flavored Perrier. A night owl, Johnson usually kept the Robinsons up until 2 or 3 a.m. As it grew late, Linda would lay face down on a living room couch, nibbling popcorn or stroking one of her 3 dogs. Each was named after an Amos and Andy character. The King Charles Spaniel was Algonquin J. Calhoun. The 2 others were Ruby Begonia and Lacey. When her husband and Johnson disappeared into a back room, Linda knew they were talking about the management agreement. In sharp contrast to its fiery birth, the pact was being gently renegotiated, largely in late-night one-on-ones between Robinson and Johnson. Jim Robinson didn't need to push hard to obtain the revisions he sought. The publicity on the greed issue had done it for him. By Wednesday, November 16th, when the revised agreement was approved in a meeting in Peter Cohen's office, Johnson had agreed to cut 2 points from his group's stake to 6.5% and to sharply scale back the incentive bonuses. New, detailed provisions were included for spreading the stock to 15,000 RJR Nabisco workers. Later, members of the management group would defend themselves on the greed issue by pointing to that fact, suggesting Johnson had agreed to trim his share of the bounty. In fact, he hadn't. At that point, Ross was really giving away other people's money, says Steve Goldstone. All along, Johnson and Horrigan had each planned to take about a point, or 1%, of the equity for themselves. Goldstone valued that point at between $75 million and $100 million over 5 to 7 years. And according to Goldstone, Johnson still planned to take 1 point under the revised agreement. Goldstone and Gar Basin jokingly chided Johnson about the talks with Robinson. "Every time you go off with Jim Robinson," Goldstone told him at one time, "you come back with $50 million less." When Johnson told his lawyer he planned to spend the weekend of November 19th at the Robinsons' Connecticut farm, Goldstone groaned. "Don't go out there," he said. "This time you'll come back with nothing." The Kravis camp's buoyant reaction to John Grinnis's disclosures was short-lived. Wednesday night, Scott Stewart got the answers to many of his remaining questions in a phone call from Dylan Reed. What he heard was startling. Working blind, Stewart had overestimated RJR Nabisco's available cash by $450 million. Golden parachute payments were $300 million more than he had guessed. And his worst fear about the other uses of cash column came true. $550 million more cash was flowing out of the company than his projections reflected. Stewart didn't need a calculator to assess the damage. $1.3 billion had to be lopped off their projections. It was roughly $6 a share. "What happened?" Paul Rather asked in amazement when Stewart brought the news to his office. No one knew. Stewart was deeply embarrassed. Already unnerved by press criticism, Kravis was shaken anew when he learned of Stewart's revisions Thursday morning. It wasn't just their effect on the projections. Kravis could live with that. The more severe blow was to their confidence. If they could be that far off on fundamental numbers, Kravis wondered, how reliable were the rest of their projections? What else didn't they know? All their analysis to date, nearly a month of work, was suddenly open to question. All this began to sink in on Thursday, not 36 hours before bids were due. It was a very bad time to get cold feet. Jesus, George Roberts said, how much do we really know about this company? It was a somber group that Kravis gathered in his office Friday morning. The same thoughts were on everyone's minds. Here it was, the biggest bid in history. And what did they really know about RJR Nabisco? They hadn't visited the factories, hadn't talked with more than a handful of executives. All they had was a pile of annual reports, government filings, and stacks of white computer runs, all of which they had lost confidence in. Their doubts fueled other concerns. Could a deal this size be done safely? Would the banks, already nervous about LBO loans, come through? Would jittery junk bond buyers want KKR's bonds? Roberts brought up lifestyle issues. They all lived quiet, tidy lives. Buying RJR Nabisco would mean a wave of publicity, Washington hearings, and an unprecedented commitment to run the company. This firm's going to be in business for a long time, Roberts said. Do we really need this aggravation? Do we really want to do this to ourselves? Paul Rather echoed. As they talked, they followed a familiar pattern. The discussion began with the most junior, Scott Stewart or Cliff Robbins, and went around the room until it stopped with Roberts. As they completed each circuit, the group grew more and more downbeat. At the outset, Kravis and Rather had been the most bullish. Both were comfortable with a bid in the range of $97 to $98. Roberts was the bear. He wasn't comfortable with anything much above $93. Why don't we do it at 91 or 92, he suggested. Why take chances? Around 2:30, Dick Beatty stuck his head in. His tone was plaintive, the school teacher hurrying children off the playground. If you guys don't hurry up and give us an answer, you're going to be left out of the bidding. I'm going to have to call over there and get an extension or something. Okay, someone said. Give us 15 more minutes. Selecting lawyers to prepare its bid, normally the most routine of tasks, became a problem for First Boston. Every major firm seemed to be up to its elbows in RJR Nabisco. So many rejected him that Maher's aides joked they should call Jacoby & Myers the nationwide discount firm. Finally, Maher selected a little-known outfit named Winthrop, Stimson, Putnam & Roberts. The firm's first task would be drafting a formal bid letter to be sent Friday afternoon. The search took so long, Finn didn't brief the lawyers until Thursday evening. The Winthrop team arrived at First Boston with a draft letter at 8 o'clock Friday morning. The lawyers waited anxiously while Maher and his lieutenants studied it. In minutes, their verdict was unanimous. The letter was a disaster. "This is shit," Fennebresque ranted behind closed doors. "This is absolute garbage," Finn agreed. "It's incomprehensible," he said, shaking his head. Irked, Maher sent the lawyers and a First Boston team to an upstairs boardroom to rework the 5-page letter. It promised to be a difficult task, but Maher wasn't too worried. They had all day. Upstairs, the scene degenerated into bedlam. A half-dozen Winthrop lawyers attempted to recast the letter. A First Boston contingent attempted its own version. Drafts were written and torn up. New lawyers filed in. First Boston people shuffled in and out. By noon, Jerry Seslow and his partners arrived, adding to the rising cacophony. Lunch was brought in. More drafts were written and discarded. Heated discussions broke out over the wording of obscure clauses. Finn's secretary, scribbling down every change and suggestion in shorthand, was an island of calm. As the afternoon wore on, A layer of smoke slowly settled atop the arguing lawyers and bankers. Tempers grew short. Points were made, then forgotten. Talks moved in circles that no one could keep track of. A paper airplane cleaved the smoky air. Seslow had never seen anything like it. First Boston's people couldn't seem to agree on the simplest things. Would they bid for the entire company or the food business? Would it be an LBO or a restructuring? Seslow retreated to a corner where he shook his head in bewilderment. He thought of Tom Pritzker and the senior Pritzker attorney on the deal, Hank Handelsman, who had remained in Chicago. "I'm just glad Hank and Tom aren't here to see this," Seslow repeated, mantra-like. No one seemed to be in charge. "What a disaster," he muttered. There was little doubt in Seslow's mind that if Jay Pritzker walked into the room, he would back out of the deal. They would. They'd just walk away, Seslow assured one of his partners. Yet in telephone conversations with Pritzker all that day, Seslow reassured the Chicago investor all was well. Seslow was acutely aware it was he who had gotten Pritzker into this deal. He wasn't going to back out until he had to. As the day wore on, Seslow found himself worrying whether First Boston was up to the task of a $20 billion takeover. To a partner, he confided, "I would feel much more confident with Wasserstein and Perella around. These guys are a shadow of their former selves." It was 2 hours before the 5 o'clock deadline when a copy of the revised letter was delivered to Maher's office. Maher read it in silence. The letter seemed to jump from point to point with no focus. Peering through its tangled verbiage, it wasn't clear exactly what First Boston wanted from the board. 1 transaction or 3, a merger or a restructuring. Maher exploded, kicking the leg of his mahogany desk and slamming his fist violently onto the desktop. "This is the worst piece of shit I've ever seen," he said. "Can't we do this right? I mean, this is awful." Maher picked up the letter, strode out past his secretary's desk, and up 3 flights of stairs to the crowded boardroom. To Finn, who knew Maher's moods, there was no mistaking the anger in his boss's clenched jaw. Within moments, the room fell silent. "You guys are missing the point," Maher told the group. "Now just listen to me. This is what we're going to do." Then, for 30 minutes, Maher dictated a new letter to Finn's secretary. When someone interrupted, Maher raised his voice and talked over him. Seslow couldn't believe the scene. It was like a teacher disciplining a roomful of second graders. For a while, he teetered on the edge of phoning Pritzker and advising him to drop out of the bidding. As the deadline approached, Maher and the lawyers were still arguing whether to bid for the entire company or just the tobacco operation. The arguments that broke out weren't just over spelling and syntax, Seslow recalled. We were still debating what form the bid would take, what we would bid for. A few minutes before 5, Maher called Skadden Arps and told Atkins the letter might be a few minutes late. "Keep in mind," Seslow told Maher after he hung up, "you still have to get this past Pritzker." It was too much for Maher. "Chicago? I've got to deal with Chicago? This is just a letter. Give me a break." "Jesus Christ, when are we going to get going?" Ed Horrigan was nearly foaming at the mouth. For 2 hours, Johnson and his entourage had sat around the paisley wallpapered Shearson dining room while butlers in white jackets took lunch orders and hovered over them with coffee and baskets of rolls. They were supposed to be discussing their bid, but so far all they had done was pass menus. Johnson couldn't believe the scene. As usual, the room was packed. A full Shearson complement, maybe a dozen people, augmented by a 9-man team from Solomon led by John Goodfriend, plus Johnson and his people. Goodfriend's group, which had downed sandwiches and styrofoam cups full of soup before arriving, sat at a separate table. "We've come over to watch everybody eat," Goodfriend said in a rare bit of humor. Johnson, Horrigan, and Sage had walked into Cohen's office that morning and found the Shearson chief standing behind his desk. "Okay, guys," Cohen had said. "What's the price going to be?" "A piss load," answered Johnson, smiling. Cohen called his secretary to get someone on the phone. Horrigan wondered what the Shearson chief had up his sleeve. A secret weapon? A moment later, Cohen picked up the phone. "Hello?" he said. Horrigan listened in anticipation. "Yes, my wife and I have talked it over. Forget the coat. We'll go with the jacket." 3 hours later, they still hadn't begun talking about their bid. The lunch went on and on, until by 1:30 even Johnson was growing impatient. "Let's get on with it, Peter," he said. "Christ," Sage blurted out. "We need a goddamn number. It's getting late." "Where is the bid?" Steve Goldstone could hear the exasperation in Gar Bason's voice. It was past 2 o'clock, and the Shearson Group hadn't yet produced a final offer. Goldstone had left Bason at Davis Polk shortly after noon and gone to check on the discussions at Shearson. He was surprised to find Cohen, Goodfriend, and more than 30 others eating a leisurely lunch, debating bid structures amid a tableau of white tablecloths, hovering waiters, and clinking china. The scene resembled a banquet more than a strategy session. "Gar, it's a borning." "Hey, come on," Bason pleaded, his voice strained over the phone line. "We need a number. We're running out of time. Steve, if they don't make up their minds soon, we'll have no bid at all." Goldstone knew his partner wasn't exaggerating. With less than 3 hours to go, Bason had been preparing more than a dozen major documents, bank commitment letters, debt documents, and other arcane papers that couldn't be completed without a final number. Bason had word processors standing by at 3 law firms. Bason got his number just after 3. Across Manhattan, at a half-dozen banks, law offices, and accounting firms, fingers flew across calculators, totting up interest rates, payment schedules, and other key ratios. By 3:45, the lawyer could see details of the bank letters were falling into place. But it was also clear the 3-inch thick bid package wouldn't be ready in time for the run uptown to Skadden Arps at 55th Street and 3rd Avenue. The logistics of time-sensitive midtown deliveries were familiar to all Wall Street law firms. Subways were out. A single smoky track fire could trap a courier for hours in the musty tunnels beneath Lexington Avenue, and portable phones were unreliable. Moreover, Bason knew the nearest subway station on the key Lexington line was 4 long blocks from Skadden Arps. He preferred taxis up the crowded parkway along the East River. At 4:20, the young lawyer ordered Solomon's lead counsel, Peter Darrow, a 26-year-old Davis Polk associate named Richard Truesdell, and 2 other lawyers into a car for the trip uptown. Several key documents the lawyers carried were incomplete, so the 4 attorneys were to pencil in the remaining numbers in the cab. Lawyers from Citibank and Bankers Trust were to meet the team at Skadden Arps with copies of the final loan documents. As they walked out, Bason handed Truesdell an NEC portable telephone. 15 minutes later, with the 4 lawyers scribbling furiously in their seats, the car sagged in heavy traffic at 14th Street. At Davis Polk, Bason crossed his fingers and kept his eyes glued to the clock. Goldstone, returning from Shearson, joined him, along with Johnson and Horrigan. Johnson, the only one relaxed, took in the scene and smiled. "At least we're going to have some fun with this." Every 5 minutes, Goldstone dialed Truesdell, who rode shotgun. "Where are you now? What block are you on?" Worried looks broke out at Davis Polk as the cab nosed through heavy traffic in the 30s and 40s. With 15 minutes to go, the cab turned off the parkway onto 1st Avenue. 10 minutes later, it crawled to a stop at 55th and 1st, where it froze in the grip of a Friday afternoon traffic jam. Goldstone was on the verge of hysteria. Horrigan, too, was beside himself. "Why's this taking so long?" he demanded. Panicking, Goldstone grabbed the phone. "Get out of the cab and run!" he barked at Truesdell. The 4 attorneys piled from the taxi and began sprinting the 2 long blocks to Skadden Arps. By then, Johnson was laughing uncontrollably. "I hope your guy was a cross-country runner," he told Goldstone, "because there's no way he's going to make it by 5 o'clock." Goldstone's eyes were glued to the clock. They weren't going to make it. Seconds later, he had Basin call an Atkins aide, Mike Gazang. "We're faxing the bid letter," Basin said. "It's coming to you now." As clerks began feeding the bid letter, page by page, into the fax machine, Goldstone listened to Truesdell's labored breathing over the portable phone. "We're at 55th and 2nd. The minutes ticked by. Johnson fielded a call from a worried Charlie Hugel. "Where's your bid, Ross?" Hugel asked. "Where's your bid?" Johnson, amused, tried to sound earnest. "We're still thinking about it, Charlie." Horrigan was in a white fury. "Can you believe this? I can't believe this." Andy Sage, who had also shown up, was dumbstruck by the spectacle. This is the gang who couldn't shoot straight. When Truesdell's breathless group reached Skadden Arps, their path was blocked by a throng of photographers and television cameras. The newsmen, spotting the portable phone, crowded around and began shouting questions. The lawyers plunged like fullbacks through the assembly and into the lobby. Inside, there was no sign of the bank team. "Where are they?" the lawyers asked, craning their necks and turning round like tops. "Where are they?" Darrow, the only one who knew the bank lawyers by sight, scurried about the lobby like a child lost at the zoo. Seconds later, Goldstone reached Truesdell. "Richard, where are you?" "In the elevator." On the 34th floor, a receptionist directed the 4 lawyers to an upper floor. "Wait, wait, wait!" Basin's reedy voice chirped over Truesdell's phone. Basin ordered a last-minute check on the preferred stock's dividend rate. Precious seconds ticked by as the number was double-checked. As Truesdell and his 3 companions spilled from the elevator on the upper floor, their way was blocked by an enormous security guard. A minute later, Truesdell was escorted into the reception area where, exhausted, he handed Peter Atkins the binder containing the group's bid. The bank letters wouldn't arrive for another 45 minutes. Darrow looked at his watch. It was 5:01. The largest takeover bid in corporate history was late. He prayed no one would notice. The Kohlberg-Kravis bid under one arm, Casey Kogut glided unnoticed past the photographers and into Skadden Arps's lobby at 10 minutes before 5. Upstairs, Kogut ducked past the security guard and called for Atkins with minutes to spare. When Atkins arrived, Kogut was sitting on the floor in a hallway, shuffling papers into his bid package to make a last-minute change. Kogut watched the guard stop everyone entering the reception area. A Skadden Arps partner, caught in the net by mistake, was screaming at the guard, "I'm a goddamn partner! I'm a goddamn partner! Now let me in!" Kogut handed Atkins the binder and left. By 7 o'clock, a full 2 hours after the deadline had passed, First Boston still had no bid. Maher had faxed copies of the letter to Jay Pritzker in Chicago. The investor and his attorneys were still ordering minor revisions. Some of the pressure had lapsed once the deadline passed, but Maher was running out of patience. This was amateurish, and he wanted the letter sent. In Chicago, Pritzker himself was having doubts about First Boston's competence. By 7, he was wondering aloud to Jerry Seslow whether to scrap the whole effort. "Do you feel First Boston is up to the task?" he asked. Seslow knew Pritzker was on the verge of backing out. All afternoon, the investor had warned Seslow he didn't want to be embarrassed by this bid. The passing of the deadline and the letter's ragged quality only fanned his concerns. "Jay, look," Seslow said, "it's clear they're not what they used to be, but they're still damn good. They have a good structure here." "Do you think we ought to go through with this?" Pritzker asked. "Jerry, how embarrassing is it for us if we back out now? Should we? Why don't we just pack it up and go home?" "I still think they can pull it off," Seslow said. "Let's just ride this thing out." Seslow knew he was putting his own word on the line, a fact he wasn't entirely comfortable with. By 9 o'clock, Maher had had enough. After suggesting to Pritzker that future snafus could be avoided if the investors' lawyers were in New York, he ordered the letters sent. Attorneys were still suggesting changes as copies were being run off. They were shouted down. All pretense at diplomacy was dropped as shouts ricocheted through First Boston's emptying halls. "Just get it out! Get it out! Forget about that! Go on! Get out of here!" The television cameras and reporters were long gone when a pair of First Boston bankers, Brian Finn and Scott Lindsay, trudged the 5 blocks up to Skadden Arps at 9:30. It was cold, and the two men were miserable. Upstairs, no one waited to take their bid. The vast law firm's corridors were quiet as Finn and Lindsay made their way to Atkins's corner office. The lawyer wasn't there. When Finn offered to wait, Atkins's secretary said he was in a meeting and couldn't be bothered. Finn handed the woman the letter. Leaving a phone number, the two men swiftly retreated. Chapter 15. Ross Johnson and Henry Kravis weren't the only ones interested in owning RJR Nabisco. By Federal Express and fax machine, the bids came that Friday. Strange, unwanted letters, Wall Street's equivalent of crank calls. By the time RJR Nabisco's auction was over, Hugel's committee would see their share of joke bids, each, of course, checked out by Dillon Reed or Lazard. A Maryland man faxed in a bid of $126 a share, or $28.4 billion. He was narrowly topped by a Winston-Salem stockbroker at $127 a share. "While I currently do not have a major investment bank retained for this purpose," the broker wrote, "I am confident that upon acceptance of this proposal, the services of several will be available to me." Hugel's favorite came from a Toronto banker. He laughed as he passed it around to the directors and investment bankers milling about a 47th floor conference room Friday evening. The fellow offered $123 a share, but with a twist. He proposed paying each member of the special committee $7 million for his vote, to pay respect for their many years donated to the company. Other directors would get $5 million. As the bids arrived, Peter Atkins held court in his corner office filled with its collection of carved wooden ducks and the usual lucite tombstones. Shadowing Atkins was Mike Mitchell, a professorial trial lawyer who worked from a casual, cluttered office down the hall. Atkins was well aware the night's events might someday be replayed in a courtroom, and Mitchell was there to make sure they played by the rules. Mitchell stood in a corner, smiling as the messengers, lawyers, bankers, and directors scurried in and out of Atkins's office. The scene reminded him of a Charlie Chaplin film. It took nearly an hour for the management group's bank documents to arrive. Every 10 minutes or so, Jim Maher called and assured them his letter would arrive any minute. A feeling of relief swept the assembled lawyers when they finally peeked at the two bids. It wasn't even close. Kravis had bid $94 a share, or $21.62 billion. Johnson had swamped him with a bid of $100 a share, or $23 billion. This was going to be easy. By 9 o'clock, Atkins dismissed the investment bankers and told the directors that they too could go home. The committee would meet Sunday morning to formally declare Johnson the winner. In the meantime, representatives from both bidding groups would come in Saturday to explain the securities in their bids. Both included large amounts of PIK securities, and Atkins needed that paper valued for the presentation Sunday morning. It was a formality, but Atkins was determined to cover all the bases. When First Boston's proposal was finally passed to him, Atkins read it closely. He hoped to brush it off as he had the other joke bids. Maher's proposal was only half-formed, he could see, really no more than an idea. It had no financing. It wasn't even clear Maher had talked with a bank. Yet First Boston was suggesting it could attain between $105 and $118 a share in a restructuring using Brian Finn's installment notes strategy. The key to the proposal was taxes, and Atkins was no tax expert. At first glance, he knew he couldn't easily disprove its thesis. If Maher could do what he said, and Atkins had little reason to believe he could, First Boston's approach could be worth $3 billion more than the other proposals. This would be a matter for Skadden's tax counsel. Until the plan could be checked, Atkins and a dozen colleagues gathered in a glass-enclosed conference room to eat dinner and hash through Maher's strange idea. Cartons of Chinese food were arrayed on a large oak table. Between them were small round containers holding dozens of sharpened pencils. A ficus tree hung lazily over their deliberations. Out the window, Manhattan's Upper East Side and, beyond it, Harlem, were gearing up for the weekend. Copies of Maher's 9-page proposal were run off and passed around. The lawyers flipped through it while eating. Around 11 o'clock, they were joined by Matthew Rosen, the team's 36-year-old tax counsel. Rosen was a lawyer from the 30-something crowd. Italian suits, tasseled loafers, an office crammed with modern art, the kind of early 1970s rabble-rouser embarrassed to tell his Swarthmore class reunion he now made millions sniffing out tax loopholes for corporate takeovers. "How'd you like to be witness number one to the lawsuit?" Mitchell asked Rosen. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell handed Rosen the First Boston binder. "Read this," he said. "It's all tax." Matt Rosen looked at the proposal for a minute, then retreated to a conference room to examine Maher's desperation bid more closely. At its core, he could see the First Boston letter harbored a nasty knot of tax assumptions whose viability was far from certain. Rosen immediately realized that the fate of the proposal, and thus of the entire auction, rested on his judgment of how reliable those assumptions were. It was up to him to advise Atkins and Mitchell whether $4 billion in taxes could actually be deferred. The senior attorneys would almost certainly take his advice. If Maher's proposal could work, Rosen knew, a new wild card would emerge, and the entire process would probably be thrown into chaos. He tried to clear the enormity of his task from his mind and concentrate on the letter before him. But as he leafed through Maher's tax assumptions, Rosen's stomach began doing somersaults. As if the stakes weren't already high enough, Rosen now noticed something far more worrisome. As he worked through the First Boston proposal, he was confronted with a single, unavoidable fact. Several of its core conclusions, including a crucial assumption on the exact treatment of the tax deferrals, were his. Rosen had been afraid this would happen. As December 31st approached, installment sales were all the rage on Wall Street. Every investment bank seemed to have a dozen in the hopper. Brian Finn was applying the same idea to at least 4 other major takeover situations for First Boston, and Finn's favorite tax lawyer was Matt Rosen. The two young men were kindred spirits, and over the years had become close friends. Many of Finn's Rube Goldberg restructuring ideas turned on esoteric tax strategies, and the two often discussed them for hours on end, especially after Finn acquired a car phone and took to badgering Rosen during his hour-long evening commutes. Finn prized Rosen for his creative solutions to the thorniest tax problems. Rosen appreciated Finn's quick mind. The young tax lawyer was already working with First Boston on an installment sale for General Cinema, which wanted to buy some Pepsi bottling operations. Now, to Rosen's growing horror, he was being asked to pass judgment on ideas he himself had helped conjure. Rosen and Finn hadn't specifically discussed RJR Nabisco. They didn't work that way. Finn talked in hypotheticals, tossing what-if scenarios to Rosen. In a kind of mental tennis game, Rosen swatted the ideas back to him, usually not knowing what companies he was discussing. But as he looked at the First Boston proposal, Rosen easily identified it as the fruit of the pair's recent conversations. Conflict of interest. Rosen hated the thought, but he knew it might apply to him. Given the nasty nature of the RJR Nabisco fight, it would only be a matter of time before someone found out about his work with Finn. In his heart, Rosen told himself he could be fair, that he wouldn't put his career on the line to help a friend. But in the litigious atmosphere of a major takeover, appearances of impropriety can prove as damaging as the real thing. Rosen was pondering his plight 45 minutes later when Atkins interrupted him. The senior lawyer couldn't stand waiting any longer for an opinion on the bid's viability. "What do you think?" he asked. Rosen took a deep breath. "Well, I've got some technical problems. A couple of things here I think are screwed up. You just can't tell. There's not enough here. If you're asking the question, Peter, whether or not this is a deal that could be done, with massaging and modification, I'd have to say yes, it could be done." Rosen then explained his problem with Finn. He trusted Atkins, had invited him to his wedding 6 months earlier. "Peter, you know I'm very familiar with this thing. We've spent a lot of time working with First Boston on just this kind of proposal." Atkins put Rosen's concerns aside for the moment. "Talk to me about the proposal," he said. "What problems stand in the way of its working?" Rosen ticked off several. For one thing, there was nothing about financing. Billions of dollars would have to be raised. A real question existed as to whether First Boston could complete its work before the tax loophole expired at year-end, now just 42 days away. In such a short time, every day would count. The deal could be derailed if First Boston were forced to undergo a lengthy antitrust review by the Federal Trade Commission. Exactly who would own which of RJR's businesses was also unclear. These were details that would have to be worked out with First Boston, Rosen said. "This is not off the wall, Peter. At its heart is a basic analysis that I'm comfortable with." Too comfortable, Rosen thought. "If the 5 or 6 questions I have are resolved favorably, as a legal matter, do I think this works?" Rosen paused. "Yeah, I think this works." Peter Atkins trusted Rosen. He wasn't all that worried about the young lawyer's fear of a conflict of interest. As far as he was concerned, the matter would be their little secret. At least partly to blunt any suggestions of impropriety, though, Atkins suggested Rosen run his advice past one of the lawyers working with Lazard and Dillon. Rosen promised to do it first thing the next morning. Into the wee hours, Rosen endured the cross-examination of his partners, including Mitchell, the crack trial lawyer. Each probed Rosen's reasoning for defects, for an opening, for a reason to ignore the troublesome First Boston letter. But Rosen held his ground. He couldn't say flat out the idea wouldn't work. As Friday slid into Saturday, the weary lawyers left, one by one, for their homes in the suburbs. At 4 o'clock, Skadden's offices were still. Outside, the streets were quiet. In a conference room down the hall, cartons of Chinese food lay cold, half-eaten. Atkins and Mitchell were the only ones left. They sat alone among the wooden ducks in Atkins's office. Rosen had left earlier, promising to talk the next day with Brian Finn. Unless Rosen changed his mind after talking to Finn, the two lawyers could tell where they were headed. "I don't see what else we can do," Mitchell was saying. He stared at a copy of the First Boston letter on Atkins's desk. "How do you ignore something like that?" Atkins nodded. He looked at Mitchell and sighed. "This is just the way it'll have to be." There were a few seconds of silence. The two men were old friends, joined by their love of the law. Pending Rosen's talk with Finn, they had made their decision. All that was left was the special committee's approval Sunday morning. Mitchell sensed the importance of the moment. "Boy," he said, "whoever expected this to happen?" Friday evening, Kravis grew excited when he heard his group had been invited to appear at Skadden Arps the next morning. It wasn't clear what the committee wanted, but word was that talks apparently weren't being held with Johnson's group. Suddenly, the malaise that led to the $94 bid lifted. "God," Kravis said, "maybe we're in good shape here." There was a moment of panic when the Kravis troops realized that Drexel's Peter Ackerman, the point man on the bid's securities, had boarded a plane to return to Beverly Hills. Ackerman would have to be put on speakerphone for the session. A different dilemma arose with Bruce Wasserstein. After the newspaper leaks, Kravis didn't trust Wasserstein and didn't want him at the meeting. The problem, Ted Ammon explained to Dick Beatty, was getting Wasserstein's assistant, Mac Rossoff, who was needed to explain some securities in the package. "You've got to call Rossoff and get him to the meeting without Bruce," Ammon said. "Me? Why do I have to do it?" "You've got to." "Oh, no," Beatty said, laughing. "You do it. He's your investment banker. I want no part of this." In the end, Wasserstein was told he wouldn't be needed. Saturday morning at 7, nearly 24 investment bankers and lawyers gathered at Kohlberg Kravis's offices. 2 hours later, Kravis led the group to Skadden Arps. Once upstairs, they kept a sharp lookout for any sign of the management group. Kravis ran into Ira Harris in a hallway. As the two men exchanged small talk, Kravis searched Harris's face for any signal of their status. A telltale smile, a shrug of the shoulders, anything. Had the management group been called? Where do we stand? But Harris was a cipher. The Kravis contingent was issued into a large conference room where it was met by a pair of investment bankers, Bob Lovejoy of Lazard and John Mullen of Dillon Reed. Wasserstein's aide, Mac Rossoff, had a sinking feeling as he saw the pair. Where was Felix Roeden? Where was Ira Harris? This, Rossoff could see, was the B team. A bad sign. Kravis, too, noticed they hadn't drawn the first team. He was startled by the presence of a junior Skadden Arps attorney named Bill Frank. What did he know about their deal? And where was Atkins? For the first time, Kravis realized that a meeting with the management group must be going on simultaneously. He grew nervous. For more than an hour, Kravis's bankers and lawyers explained in detail each component of their bid package, with particular emphasis on its securities. This was nuts and bolts Wall Street work. The meeting droned on and on, as representatives from each of Kravis's half-dozen investment and commercial banks proudly explained their specialties. Then, as Scott Stewart was reciting a set of Kravis's projections, Bob Lovejoy stopped him. The data Stewart was reading didn't match the figures among the papers in Lovejoy's lap, the Lazard banker said. If the special committee had done its